Welcome to our first Charity Chats of 2023. My name is Charles Mesquita. I'm a Charities Director at Quilter Cheviot. I'm joined by my two partners in crime. I've got Catherine Rustomji, who is the charity partner at Shakespeare Martineau, and also James Saunders, who's charity partner at Moore Kingston Smith. Welcome, guys. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
So today there are two things that have caught my attention in the press. So the first thing is about GCHQ offering free support to small charities for the risk of a cybercrime, which was actually closely followed by the headlines that the Queen's portraitors were fraudulently claimed £50,000 in the COVID loan for charity. So I thought we would start the year on the very jolly subject of cybercrime and fraud. I have to say that BDO, I know, have brought out a report recently on the subject, but actually the one that was most comprehensive one, I think, was about 2017, where you got Crow, Experience and the Centre of Counter Fraud, who estimated that the fraud in the sector was about 2.3 billion. Now, the Charity Commission come up with somewhere between 150 to 2 billion, so where it is. But I think more importantly is where the fraud seems to be happening, which is more internal than external. So perhaps I'll start with you, James, as a charity auditor. I suspect you've got a number of war stories. So what advice would you give to trustees to minimise the risk of fraud and cybercrime?
Happy New Year, Charles. Happy New Year. In light of the subject, I think it's about awareness. It's about awareness of the types of threats. So there's an element of education around this, keeping yourself aware of the sort of threats that are attacking the charity sector in particular, and entities in general. And then it's understanding your response to those. So having the right processes and systems, software to make sure that you, as best you possibly can, you're safe against these sort of efforts. It's the very fast changing nature that is really key to this. You mentioned a couple of reports. Actually, my colleague at more ClearCom, with our cybersecurity consultant, Richard Jackson, wrote a report for us recently on fraud in the academies sector specifically, and the education sector. And it's interesting because we spent about a month or so writing it, I think, between us and editing it. And in that time, a brand new case arose from a massive, cyber attack on an educational establishment arose in America, which we managed to write about. But it was such a short space of time. We started the report. Suddenly, there was a brand new case to consider and use as a case study. So it's almost every week, every month, there's a new case coming up. But it's that very quick change around that very fast nature of the attackers that is very difficult to deal with.
So should we separate? I mean, I suppose fraud and cybercrime as two very different, of which it is, but has happened to get lumped together in a thing. So perhaps if we start with, I know we'll come on to again more onto cybercrime, but start with the fraud element of it, because I do think that's a massive issue, which is probably more easily dealt with than perhaps cybercrime. I don't know what you think on that.
Yeah, I mean there's the I use the word traditional, but the familiar from days gone by, emptying an FD, for example, emptying a bank account or something along those lines, or hiding transactions and of course this is an internal risk. This is the risk that one or some of your staff, and invariably actually it probably has to be some of your staff, because collusion is the big danger here. These days, I think most organisations are aware that having one person sign off on things is the big danger. So clearly checks and controls is important. So therefore the next step along that line is, if you're going to get in trouble, it's probably through collusion. But that more traditional view of fraud as something that is internal, something that someone in your organisation steals money from you as an organisation. I mean, you do see the headlines in the charity press reasonably regularly. There's often once a week, once a month, maybe or more than that, once a couple of weeks. There's a charity FD has been convicted of stealing some money from a charity. So that's all about knowing where your weaknesses are we of course we all know that in smaller organizations, voluntary organizations, there is always going to be an element of trust to some extent. You cannot mitigate and de-risk completely control over financial transactions. The key is to know where those risks are, to be aware of it, to be honest about the risks and where the potential control weaknesses might be, and try and avoid giving anyone the chance to make easy inroads into those controls. So yeah, it's a difficult. It is often a very difficult conversation to have internally about about controls around fraud, and for a trustee, for example, a financial trustee, to be really strict with a financial control or an FD in a small charity where they might be a part of a very small team. But it's about being open and honest, and all the time you're open and honest, I think you're probably doing as much as you can beyond putting the systems in.
It's interesting though, isn't it, James? I think because trustees by nature are trusting. And so it's hard, I think, for them to take the person out of it and focus on process rather than it feel like they're accusing. But I do find it interesting when we do read those cases, there is a big focus on it has been abuse of trust, abuse of position, that there is that special status of charities that, they shouldn't be exploited by those within them, but I think they are a target and they need to make that as difficult as possible for people to be able to succeed in those attempts.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. Invariably, these cases, to my mind, they happen because actually the review processes, for example, are there, the monitoring processes are there, but for whatever reason they're not done rigorously. Maybe someone takes their eye off the ball. Maybe there is that over trust that comes in. And of course, we'll go back to that point that trustees, of course, are always voluntary. It's always their spare time. So if they're involved in the monitoring process, that you've got to be very rigorous in your own approach to these matters to make sure that if you are going to visit the FD or the FC or the finance department each month, let's say, you do it, because otherwise you open up the gaps. That's really, and you've got to respect the process because the other people are relying on that, for the protection of the financial department, for example, the financial team. They're relying on you to make sure they are protected as well from these sort of problems.
But I think you've got to start with the starting point, isn't it? As a trustee, well, one, it's not just necessarily staff, it can be trustees and volunteers. So you need to think about this as wider. I think that, the estimate is about 90% of fraud is internal. So actually, it's very easy to us to look externally and think that's where the problem lies, where actually you need to think about it internally. And I know because, trustee of a couple of organizations that have less than 5 employees. So you can't put in lots of protocols that you might want to do to stop the collusion. But one of the ways we've got round it, so 2 things I think I would say. One is we've looked to outsource some of the finance function, which has actually worked really well. So that then puts, another area in. And I've said to the people who are doing that is that they should be looking for any irregularities because, they should be able to pick up on that. And the other thing actually as a trustee, and when you're looking at your risk register, is actually, it is the question I do ask, and I ask openly of staff about, how do we make sure that we minimize the risk of fraud prevention and make them, part of the solution and the sort of the whistleblowing, or if they see anything suspicious that they should feel comfortable to come forward on it. So I think it's a question that, it's very easy to say, oh, well, it's all internal, therefore we can't have the conversation. But actually, I think we need to have the conversation, but it's just a question of how you frame it.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the other subject you touched on actually was cyber attacks now, which of course is a different dimension. It's the external attacks on your organization. I mean, horribly commonplace. Everyone's got a story about an attack, even if it's an unsuccessful one. The emails that they get from their colleagues that look very close to their colleagues' email addresses but aren't quite. I mean, they're very well known. That we are seeing more email hijacking, as in getting inside the email systems these days, which is more effective because, of course, it does actually come from the email account of a person in your organization rather than one that looks a bit like it. And of course, in those situations, then the clever hacker, unfortunately, can get inside the emails, can look at tone of voice that people use, and rather than so can start to mimic the tone of voice of the sender of the email. They can look at controls documents if they've been emailed around. So there's a whole new world of opportunity for a hacker if they can get inside the email system. There should still be those controls in place that mean, even in especially in a small team, but even in a larger organization, go and talk to the person who is asking you to release the money on a certain account or whatever. If you're getting directions over email to do something financial, the easy answer is go and make sure that somehow you go beyond just the email instruction. But we're seeing that a lot. We're seeing, the technology as well is coming in as well. So we had reported of an instance where a member of staff in a hospitality venue was using their own card machine, and they were able to present this to people who were paying, and the people would obviously pay this into the staff member's bank account, not the organization's bank account. So the technology has made it possible to bring these things out.
And sort of, Catherine, for sort of looking for solutions here, of as a trustee, what's the sort of things that you would look for to do to help minimize those sorts of risks from cybercrime?
Yeah, and I suppose I think there is an education piece, I think, for trustees to inform themselves, to not look at it and say, oh, it's technical, I don't understand it. It's at least trying to understand what the threats are. And then I think you need that connection between the trustees and senior management within the charity to say, okay, what are we doing, so that you make this an ongoing review question, so that the trustees do continue to have oversight of cybersecurity, cyber safety, recognizing that as a key risk and a threat to the organization. And I think just managing it accordingly, rather than, I do wonder at the moment if it's just kind of parked and thought nobody really understands it, so we don't know what questions to ask, whereas the principles should be the same, that it's a threat and how are we minimizing the risk.
I must admit, as a trustee, the two things that I would be thinking of at the moment. One is, what training are we doing of our staff, and where can we get that training? Because I don't know about you guys, but certainly in the business I'm in, we've got training capping every year on sort of cybercrime, fraud, and everything else, and we're required to by the regulator. And the second thing is when you've had changes to working practices and turnover of staff, of what protocols. So I wonder, in fact, you've just triggered a thought, which I'm going to take back, is, having gone to home working, have we actually looked at what our protocols are, and whether the risks have changed and whether we need to adapt to that? So I suspect there are lots of easy, sort of, it's not easy, but simple things you can do to minimize that risk.
Yeah, and everything will help, won't it? I think it's these little mini steps that say, don't do nothing because you can't tackle the problem. Just start to think how you could cover off some of these areas.
So it sounds like to me that as trustees, you really, in any organization, ask what the protocols are, and then are they being followed, and then what other things that we should be doing. And actually, when you've got a group of people, you've probably come up with all the right answers. The other thing that caught my eye in the press this week was around guidance to social media. Now, I have to say, having read the guidance and also seen some of the press comments, there seems to be a bit of a disconnect from my point of view, in the respect that the guidance actually seemed to be very sensible and very pragmatic. Catherine, I don't know whether you've read some of the comments.
I have, yeah. Again, the Charity Commission, this is their approach. When they see an issue, they try and publish guidance to help all charities understand it. So clearly, there has been an issue around social media use by charities. And I think we have seen this with some of the investigations that the Charity Commission has looked into, and complaints that are made against charities. So I think, some charities, I think, are a bit flippant, a bit careless, a bit loose, maybe, in their social media usage and the language and the messaging that they're putting out there. So I think there is a point for charities to be more aware of, think of it, be careful, it's a big audience. The complaints I've seen around the guidance are to do with how you separate Catherine as my job from Catherine as a normal person, and that would people now be required to have two separate media, social media identities, that you use one that you do for work and one that you use personally, because there seems to be this subtle connection, that even if you post it in your personal capacity, if you're showing yourself as a trustee of X charity, then by implication that's going to be connected to the charity and potentially a risk. But I don't think it's impossible to manage that. And also the Charity Commission have been very open and said, well, that's why we're having a wide consultation on this, so people can let us know their views. So I think there is an opportunity there for charities that want to put those views across. I did wonder if it might be more of the kind of neutering about political campaigning and criticising, and whether that was the message, but I wasn't picking that up from the guidance when I was reading it. But I do think we'll see more as people respond.
Yeah, I have to say, I think the political bit is the bit that I was struggling most with about how do you deal with that. James, do you have a view on this? Have you looked at this?
Not particularly. I mean, I think it's only the same struggle that a Gary Lineker would have had when he gets into slight trouble. You know, there's often the argument about whether he's representing the BBC and Match the Day or not, and it's one of a number of similar cases. So you know, it's not something that hasn't been seen before, and I can see the sense. I mean, I can see the sense in having two different accounts, and especially if you're going to post views that are in your personal context, quite opinionated. But you know, I think in the end, you know, that discussion will always be had online.
Yeah, I suppose the one piece of advice I would give, not that I'm great on social media, but is to be very clear when you're posting something and whether you're doing it in a personal capacity or in the capacity of representing an organisation. Anyway, I think that's a good place to stop. A meaty subject that we've covered in a fairly brief area, but I think certainly we'd encourage trustees to take a look at this, not be fearful of looking at these areas and making sure that they've got the right protocols in place. But thank you, and we will look forward to the next session.